Nirasya sarva sandeham ekikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram itam Sri Radhika Nata pada sarojayo yena premanubhutyasha datta tam Shri Gurum bhaje Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vidashujitan Purna Prema Rasutsavo Jadamanu Vritti Prasannananan Shashvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payo Rasho Muda Kedato Vande Bhagavatani Mananudavam Murdna Nipatyakshito Namo Mahavaranyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tvishe Nama Jayatam Surato Pango Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambujo Radha Madana Mohano Kuladi Devatamar Madana Mohan Jar Sevak Raghunatha Rup Sanatan Jaya Rupa Sanatana Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jiva Gosvami Dasa Raghunath Echai Goshai Kori Charana Vandan Jaha Hoite Vignanasha Bhishta Puran Raganugami Bhajano Lasam Manasanam Shri Radhaya Sarasmara Vrajantum Bhaje Shri Rupa Charana Kamala Shita how is it? Shri Rupa Pada Charana Kamala Pada Chetasam Me Satam Chitam Madhukari Yadtu Pada Padme Trying to remember another verse there. And one other one I'd like to add, if I may, is the verse by the commentator in praise of our Padyavali, which is also nice to remember before we cite. So this is, we discussed in the introduction, Yaram ya nikilaga sanga shamani shrotratitim sangata yasadya rasikai sukapti janani dikarya mukti spriham Yadhyatha hridaye vrajanda tanuja premamrita syandhani Saji yadhari bhakta vrinda mohita dhanyeha Padyavali. So by the grace of Sri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, the Swabhajana Vibhajana Prayojana Avatar Prema Purushottam Karuna Mahasagar and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnava charges, the fulfiller of his heart's desires, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. Again today we will discuss Padyavali, and we will resume our discussion of the Tṛṇād sunīcena verse of Srimad Mahaprabhu. We're presently discussing the quality of mānadena, or respectfulness, or giving honor to others. So, we've had a couple of discussions of this. We've talked about the angle of vision, or the premise for why honor is to be offered to others, namely recognition of the pervading presence of Bhagavan within the object of honor. And we heard Chakravarti Pad's Vyatirek instruction, or in other words, the reverse instruction, to show respect to others not on the basis of the presence of Bhagavan within them, and not with reference to the supreme honorability of Bhagavan, will be a transgression for a bhakta. So one should honor others by virtue of their being dwelling places of Bhagavan, and one should not offer conditional respect irrespective of the object of honor's relation to Bhagavan. And we also discussed, in addition to this, some additional layers of motivation for honoring others, such as the spirit of Braja, or the bandhutva of Braja, the unconditional, supportive and well-wishing spirit of both Krishna and the Brajabasis. Those who have imbibed this spirit will also naturally show respect to others in this manner. And also, we talked about a gradation in honorability, how while everyone is due a certain degree of fundamental respect, some are due greater respect. And this criterion of greater or lesser respectability is determined by the level of awareness of the recipient of honor of Bhagavan. In other words, the more one is aware of Bhagavan, the more intense the presence of Bhagavan within the person, therefore the greater honorability of the person. So bhaktas are shown a greater degree of honor than non-bhaktas because of that greater intensity of presence of Bhagavan within them by virtue of their awareness and devotion to Bhagavan. So now today we'll go into a sub-analysis of that, and we'll look at some categories or a gradation in bhaktas to understand more about how among bhaktas, some bhaktas are more honorable than others by virtue of their greater depth of bhakti. So having discussed this and a couple other points, we'll conclude the topic of offering honor to others. So I'm picking up from where I left off. So we finished the topic of these 5 levels of honorability, from non-human entities to human beings to Gyanis to bhaktas, and ultimately the objects of worship of bhaktas, namely deities of Bhagavan. This gradation was given. So now we'll hear about gradations among bhaktas. So regarding the honoring of bhaktas of Sri Bhagavan, it is also to be understood that although all bhaktas are especially worthy of honor in comparison to human beings in general and Gyanis, still among bhaktas there is also a gradation in honorability based on the relative depth of their bhakti. In this regard, an analysis of 3 general levels of bhaktas is taught by Sri Havi Yogendra in Srimad Bhagavatam. Quote, a gradation among bhaktas exists based on a gradation in their rati and prema. In the 11th canto, their characteristics have been explained. So the greater the depth of prema, the greater the stature of the bhakta, the greater the respectability of the bhakta. These 3 levels of bhaktas are summarized in the following 3 verses, and are presented here in order from higher to lower. In other words, in the Bhagavatam, the highest level is described first, then the intermediate level, then the junior level, but we'll discuss it in reverse order because I think it'll be a little easier to understand that way. And the commentaries of Sri Jiva Pod that elucidate the meaning of each verse, describing each level, are given after each verse. So we'll read each verse with the commentary of Jiva Gosvami to understand what specifically is the nature of each of these categories or each of these levels in the gradation. So starting with level 1, one who for Hari performs puja with faith, only of the deity and not of his bhaktas or others, is considered a beginning bhakta. So Jiva Gosvami explains this as follows. One performs puja only of the deity, not of his bhaktas, and consequently not of anyone else either, because of a lack of prema for Bhagavan, a lack of knowledge of the greatness of bhaktas, and a lack in oneself of the quality of a bhakta in the form of respect for everyone. So here, Jiva Goswami is also stressing the point that we're looking at, which is this idea that it's a quality of a bhakta to respect everyone. So when one doesn't have that quality, when one doesn't know the greatness of bhaktas or know the respectability of bhaktas, and one lacks prema for Bhagavan, such that one may consider Bhagavan worthy of high regard, but not yet understand that to truly honor Bhagavan is to also honor all that is dear to Bhagavan and all that is Bhagavan's own, lacking that degree of knowledge and love, then a person may show respect only to a deity of Bhagavan, but not to other bhaktas or other living beings. So he is beginning or prakrita. That is, he is one in whom the fundamental form is beginning, meaning one in whom bhakti is beginning just now to manifest itself. This faith, that is the faith mentioned in this verse, with which this beginning bhakta performs puja, furthermore, is not born of ascertainment of the meaning of Shastra. Because of such a beginning bhaktas, not understanding the Shastra. So this is a very important point, is that ideally, Shraddha is an outcome of having understood the meaning of Shastra. So Jiva Gosvami elsewhere defines Shraddha as Shastrartha Vishwas, or conviction in the meaning of the Shastra. So you can have conviction in the meaning and also not necessarily have understood the meaning or ascertained what the meaning is. So ideally, you have both conviction in the meaning, whatever it may be, and you have understanding of what that meaning is. And when you have both, you could say the grip or the attachment that the Shraddha produces, as well as the accuracy as far as what specifically you're holding on to, that comes from understanding the meaning, then one's in an ideal position to practice bhakti, or has the ideal eligibility or qualification to do so. So when one lacks that understanding, then what one holds to, and thus what one performs, is less than ideal, or you could say is miscalibrated. So now he cites a verse in the Bhagavatam to illustrate an instance of a lack of understanding. So, quote, one who has a notion of self in relation to a corpse made of the three elements, a concept of own in relation to a wife and so forth, a concept of worshipability in relation to earth, and a sense of a tirtha in relation to water, but never any of these, that is a sense of self, belonging, worshipability, or source of purification, in relation to realized persons, that is, persons who have experience of Bhagavan, is what's called a gokara, or a donkey fit only to do labor to feed cows. Or in other words, a cow has great utility and is an object of great honor, but a donkey, the only thing a donkey is good for is carrying loads of food to bring to feed the cows. So what's called a gokara means a donkey that's kept in order to haul loads for the sake of keeping cows. So this is considered, not just subhuman, but subhuman, if you will, or an inferior rank of animal. So this is a rather bold or blunt statement in the Bhagavatam, which is meant to kind of shake a listener. So what it's meant to convey is that one shouldn't identify with the body, one should identify oneself as a soul. One shouldn't think of one's house or relatives or possessions as truly belonging to oneself. If anyone is dear to you or if anything belongs to you, it's the bhaktas. They're your own people, not just whatever persons your karma has cast you amidst in this life. And if anything is worshipable, it's not some earth or some building or some arch or some dome or something like this. Rather, it's a place where Bhagavan's bhaktas have walked, where they have performed their lila, where they have relished their prem, and so on. If anything is purifying, it's not water, it's the purifying force of visiting a holy place and the spiritual purification that can come from doing so. So when people lack these types of understanding about what is worshipable, what is purifying, what is the self, what is the right sense of belonging, and they foster them for external worldly things rather than for spiritual things, then they're considered to have not understood the meaning of Shastra. And they may have conviction in these things. They may think that by going and rubbing some dust from some place on their head, they're going to get some particular benefit or what have you. But this will be a type of conviction that is not born of ascertaining the actual teachings of the Shastra. So a bhakta who has such inaccurately calibrated conviction, if you will, is what is being referred to here as a beginning bhakta. Or more specifically, a particular category of beginning bhakta. So this is what Jiva Gosvami distinguishes here finally. He says, therefore, that is the shraddha of a beginning bhakta, is only that attained from folk tradition, or a loka parampara. In other words, a succession of practice or a succession of opinion or belief that just comes from people, whoever you've met, your family, your neighbors, your locality, your ethnic, the primary features of your ethnicity, all of these things. So when one's viewpoints, one's convictions are fixed upon things that are acquired through folk tradition, rather than directly through study and ascertainment of the meaning of Shastra, then the Shraddha that someone has is not Shastriya Shraddha, it's called Lokik Shraddha, or it's Shraddha based on Loka Parampara. So he says, and thus, a sadhaka possessed of Shastriya Shraddha, in whom prema has not manifested, is certainly to be known as the primary type of neophyte or Kanishta Bhakta, rather than the neophyte bhakta described in this verse, who lacks Shastriya Shraddha. So here what Jiva Goswami is doing is he's saying the way that the Bhagavatam is depicting a Kanishta, or a beginner, he's saying that's a big beginner, or a really raw beginner. But more properly speaking, a beginner should be defined as one has Shastriya Shraddha, but hasn't, acquired or hasn't gone beyond a basic level of understanding and conviction in that. That would be, properly speaking, a beginner, because properly speaking, the Shraddha that makes one eligible for this path is Shastriya Shraddha, not Lokik Shraddha. But at the same time, because even persons with Lokik Shraddha are nevertheless performing acts of worship of Bhagavan, performing acts of bhakti, and may stand well in the future by virtue of what sadhu sangha they may acquire, by the purifying effect of what acts of bhakti they may perform, to also acquire further eligibility, then they're also included, they're also accepted as being bhaktas or as being beginning bhaktas, but Jiva Goswami is saying they won't be the primary type. Oops, sorry about that, someone is calling me. Just a sec. Okay. And one piece I want to throw in here, 2 cents, is that I'm inclined, this is my own just 2 cents on this topic, is that if Jiva Goswami is making this kind of 2 categories, Shastriya Shraddha, Lokik Shraddha, then do these things exist in complete isolation? In other words, does someone have 100% Lokik Shraddha and 0 degree Shastriya Shraddha? Probably not. They might have heard a little something from, they might have heard a little something from the Shastra in the course of even their village experience or their experience of their local culture or their family or what have you. So it's not that someone is necessarily all one or all the other. There's a gray scale between the two. And I would also add that in the modern day, where within our tradition there's a significant wing of persons related to the tradition who also participate in the tradition in the context of an institution, and institutions or leaders or representatives of institutions may also imbue certain teachings or certain sensibilities, attitudes into participants that are not entirely based on the Shastra. Then that also will come as like another gray area or another middle area. It might not be entirely folk tradition, it's not entirely Shastric tradition, it's a murky intermediate zone that has elements of both. It has some elements from the Shastra, some elements from folk tradition, some elements unique to a particular institution's tradition. And therefore, even persons whose Shraddha is not purely Shastriya Shraddha, but contains core elements that are fixated upon institutional narratives rather than conclusions of the Shastra, that will also make that person not in the category of the primary beginner that Jiva Goswami describes, but as a lesser status. From a conceptual analysis, I don't mean this in a deprecating manner to anyone who may foster conviction in any particular institutional narratives. They're welcome to do so if they so wish. But according to Jiva Goswami's analysis, this will be something that alloys or reduces the purity of one's eligibility for the particular path that's being defined here in the Bhagavatam and by the Rupa Goswami and Jiva Goswami himself. So, like this, we have the idea of the beginning bhakta. They have some awareness of Bhagavan, they offer some worship to Bhagavan, but that understanding, that awareness is mixed with, or maybe predominantly in the form of what's understood through folk tradition, and may not be based on an accurate understanding of the Shastra, an accurate understanding of the self, of Bhagavan, of bhaktas, of tirthas, and so on. So, moving on now to the intermediate category. One who fosters prema, friendship, grace, and disregard, respectively, in relation to Ishvara, his dependents, that is his bhaktas, the unknowing and the inimical, is an intermediate. So this is meant to be read with parallel construction, so to speak. In other words, one who fosters prema in relation to Ishvara, friendship in relation to his bhaktas, grace in relation to the unknowing, and disregard in relation to the inimical, is an intermediate. So Jiva Goswami comments on this as follows. Now he defines an intermediate Bhagavat only with a particular mental characteristic. So in other words, it's not that this is the only way to understand an intermediate bhakta. This is one of a number of characteristics of a bhakta of that category. So he's specifying this is a particular mental characteristic that bhaktas of this stature have, not that it's the only one. So, quote, one fosters prema for the supreme Ishvara, meaning one becomes possessed of bhakti for him. So the way he's interpreting it here is it's not that the word prema in this case is equivalent to the prema bhakti defined in the first verse of the 4th chapter of the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, but here he's taking the word prema in a looser sense of bhakti and saying that but there are other interpretations of this verse where it is interpreted as prema, specifically the prema bhakti of the siddha stature. But in this context, we're not going into that interpretation because it's not necessary for the purpose of understanding the gradation in who's honorable. We want to understand both how to honor prema bhaktas and how to honor bhaktas who may not yet be prema bhaktas. So therefore, I've chosen this particular commentary to discuss in this context. So one fosters prema for the supreme Ishvara, meaning one becomes possessed of bhakti to him. One fosters friendship with his dependents, that is, his bhaktas. One fosters grace towards the unknowing, that is, those unaware of bhakti to him, and thus indifferent to him, as described by Sri Tṛṇād in the Bhagavad, quote, I lament for the deluded, their minds averse to that is, the great nectar of singing of your Bhagavan's prowess, who are engrossed only in bearing the burden of worldly life, for the sake of the illusory pleasure derived from sense objects. So that pretty much says it all about worldly existence. I lament for the deluded, their minds averse to the nectar of singing about Bhagavan, who are engrossed only in bearing the burden of worldly life, for the sake of the illusory pleasure derived from the sense objects. So, to those deluded persons, he fosters grace, or in other words, he's compassionate, he's kind to them. And one fosters disregard towards those inimical towards oneself, meaning one fosters indifference by means of non-disturbance of the mind in regard to their enmity. because of the presence in one's mind of even a fraction of grace even towards them, that is, the inimical to oneself, on account of their being unwise, just as Sri Prahlād did in regard to Hiranyakashipu. So this is quite interesting. When he says that he fosters disregard, that doesn't mean that he disregards in the sense that he treats them disrespectfully. Means he disregards them within his own mind towards himself. In other words, he doesn't allow his own mind to be disturbed by their inimical behavior. So that means they may treat him harshly or disrespectfully, but he doesn't even allow that to unsettle himself. And this is something we'll talk about more when we get to the quality of tolerance like a tree. So, when they, that is inimical persons, are also inimical towards Bhagavan or Bhagavatas, however, so if the person's just inimical to me directly, then I'm not going to let myself get disturbed by it. But if they're offensive to Bhagavan, if they're offensive to Bhagavatas, means Bhaktas, then when disturbance of the mind occurs, in other words, that may genuinely be upsetting. In other words, if someone's disrespecting me, why should I be bothered by it? Why should I get upset? But if someone is making offense to some Vaishnava in front of me, that I'm not going to like. That I may feel creates some disturbance in my mind. So in that context, what to do? When disturbance of the mind occurs as a result of their enmity towards Bhagavan or Bhagavatas, one remains non-absorbed in that. That is, in that disturbance of the mind. In other words, some disturbance of the mind will come, but even at that, I'm not going to feed into that, or I'm not going to allow that to unsettle me greatly. I'll notice that the disturbance is there, I'll acknowledge it, I'll act as appropriate in the circumstance externally, and I won't be excessively unsettled. Thus, one has or experiences only a manifestation in the mind of grace towards the unknowing and of disregard towards the inimical, and not rather a manifestation of prema everywhere like the former, that is, like the advanced Bhagavatas mentioned in the verse that we'll discuss next. Thus, the intermediacy of the Bhagavata possessed of the mental state described in this verse is established. So the advanced Bhakta will see a manifestation of prem in everyone, but the intermediate Bhakta, he'll see that he doesn't see prem, he sees aparad, he sees someone doing something wrong or someone doing something ignorant. He doesn't necessarily see that everyone is acting with prema, and in a practical sense, that perspective may be more accurate or literally true, but nevertheless, the perspective of the advanced bhakta, who sees prema even in those who might, so generally speaking, not have it, even if that might be less literally valid, it's more exalted from a spiritual perspective. So in that sense, the bhakta with this, so to speak, quote-unquote, realistic vision is considered intermediate. So now we come to the advanced bhakta. And this verse about the advanced bhakta can be interpreted in a number of different ways. This is just one particular viewpoint, which is relevant to the context. Quote, one who can see one's own manifestation of Bhagavan, that is, one's Ishtadevata, within all entities, and all entities within the Bhagavan within oneself, that is, within the shelter of the manifestation of Bhagavan, who is manifest within one's own mind, is an advanced Bhagavata. Therein, he defines a great Bhagavata, a Mahabhagavata, with a mental characteristic intelligible by means of various experiences, or anubhavas. Sarva Bhuteshu, he speaks this verse. One who can see, pashyat, that is, one who experiences only one's own manifestation of Bhagavan, that is, the appearance of Bhagavan which is desired by oneself, i.e. one's Ishtadevata, quote, within all entities, that is, in the conscious and the unconscious entities throughout existence, specifically as per the manner stated in Bhagavatam 11.2.41, quote, one of one-pointed mind can offer obeisance to space, the air, fire, water, earth, the luminaries, living beings, the directions, trees, and so forth, the rivers and oceans, and whatever else is existent. In other words, whatever they see the presence of the Ishta Devata there, and they bow to that. And how is it, why do they do that? On account of one's being captivated by anurag, that is, prema for Bhagavan, which is causative of anubhavas, such as melting of the heart, laughing and crying, as per the demeanor described in a statement of Sri Kavi in the previous verse of the Bhagavatam. That is, quote, one whose right is so, in whom anuraga has manifested, by chanting the names of Bhagavan dear to oneself, and who is thus of melted heart, loudly laughs, cries, shouts, sings, and dances as though mad, oblivious to society. And who thus experiences those, quote, entities only in him, that is, as being sheltered only in him, the Bhagavan who manifests there in oneself, that is, in one's own heart, is an advanced Bhagavata. So this Bhagavata is seeing Bhagavan, seeing the presence of his Ishta Devata in every being, in every particle of the animation. His heart is completely melted as he chants the name of that Bhagavan. He's laughing, he's crying, he's dancing, he's singing. He doesn't care what anybody thinks. And he's bowing down to that perceived presence of his Ishta Devata in the sky, in the water, in the trees, in the clouds, anywhere and everywhere. So that is an advanced bhakta, that is a prem bhakta, that is a mahabhagavata. So there is a statement by the blessed Devis of Braja of exactly this attitude. So in the Yugal Gita, as the gopis are lamenting during the day in separation from Krishna while he's out in the forest, then they also speak in this manner, saying, quote, the forest creepers and trees abounding with fruits and flowers, their branches borrowed under the weight thereof, their branches bowed under the weight thereof, their bodies delighted with prema, shower streams of nectar, as though manifesting Vishnu in their hearts. So the gopis are seeing these trees, and they're not just seeing trees, they're seeing that this tree is actually an ecstatic bhakta who's overwhelmed with sattvic vikaras, who's feeling the presence of Bhagavan within their heart, and then their fruits, their flowers, their branches, these are all perceived as expressions of the ecstasy of that bhakta's prema for Bhagavan. So the gopis in this way are seeing the presence of their Ishta Devata in the heart of this tree, and seeing the external characteristics of the tree as though exhibiting the sattvika bhavas. Alternately, the first half of the verse can be interpreted as follows. One who sees only one's own bhava, that is prema for Bhagavan, in all conscious and unconscious entities. So in this verse, it says bhavam, bhagavat bhavam. So the word bhava can mean presence or existence. So interpreted in that way, it means one who can see Bhagavan's presence. In other words, Bhagavan. Or the word bhava can be interpreted here to mean prema. So bhagavat bhavam would mean prema for Bhagavan. So interpreted in that way, the bhakta with prem sees everyone as though they have prem too. The remainder, in the case of this alternate interpretation, is the same as in the previous. Therefore, out of bhakti manifest from the perception of his dwelling place in the form of a bhakta, being present in all entities, one offers obeisance to them, that is, to all entities, as stated previously in 11.2.41 that we already cited. In exactly the same way, it is also stated by the Braja Devis in particular, this time from the Venu Gita, quote, then, hearing that song of Mukunda, the rivers, their currents obstructed by an upwelling of love, beheld in the form of whirlpools, as they bear offerings of lotuses, clasped with the arms of their waves the 2 feet of Murari, which had been stopped by their embrace. So this is a way where they're not seeing necessarily the presence of Bhagavan within the heart of the tree, but now they're seeing the presence of their prema in the river, and they're seeing the whirlpool, the activity of the river, as though expressions or acts of prema. Alternately, it is stated by the blessed city queens of Dwaraka, so the same concept in an expression of the queens of Dwaraka. This time they see an osprey. So they say, "O Lady Osprey, you wail devoid of sleep and do not rest, while Ishvara, whose wakefulness is concealed, sleeps at night in this world. O friend, like us, has your heart been deeply pierced by the charming, playful glances and smiles of he of lotus eyes?" So the queens can't sleep, and then they hear this osprey also singing or calling out at night. So they think, oh, this bird must have prema for Ishvara like us. And as we have, our hearts are pierced by Krishna's glances, we can't sleep thinking about him. That's why this bird must also not be sleeping. She must also be thinking about him, and therefore singing sleeplessly late in the night. So in this way, they're seeing the presence of their own prema in the heart of the bird. So in this case, it's not that this is a meditation, or it's not that this is a practice, but rather these bhaktas are so steeped in the intensity of the experience of their prema that they don't even have the awareness that what they're experiencing is unique to themselves. Rather, they, without, you could say, consciously trying, they generalize their interpretation onto the entities in the animation around them. So this is the highest stature of bhakti, where these things happen automatically. So now to come back, why are we discussing all these levels? The point here is to describe the characteristics of these levels of bhaktas, so that one can understand which bhaktas are worthy of what degree of honor. In summary, with regard to these 3 levels of bhaktas, the beginning level bhakta honors only the deity and not Sri Bhagavan's bhaktas or Sri Bhagavan's presence in other living beings. The intermediate level bhakta acts in a unique reciprocally appropriate manner in regard to Sri Bhagavan, his bhaktas, those who are unaware of the importance of bhakti to Sri Bhagavan, and those who are inimical to bhakti or oneself. The advanced level bhakta not only meditates on, but directly perceives, by virtue of bhakti, the presence of Sri Bhagavan and prema for him, in all living beings, and thus honors all of them in accord with this vision of them. In accord with these 3 different levels of awareness of Bhagavan, bhaktas are to be honored to a greater or lesser extent. So this is the Bhagavatam's discussion of a gradation in bhaktas. Now we'll get to a couple more criterions for gradation. Sriman Mahaprabhu has also taught that Vaishnavas can be conceived of as being of a standard, superior, and superlative level based on their respective characteristics. He explains that beginning from the characteristic of their having chanted the name of Krishna once, moving up to the characteristic of their constantly chanting the name of Krishna, and advancing further to the characteristic of others taking up chanting the name of Krishna as a result of meeting them, 3 grades of Vaishnavas can be conceived and honored to a successively greater extent. A similar gradation in the honorability of Vaishnavas and gradation in the degree to which honor is to be shown to them is described in Upadeshamrita, verse 5. Quote, "Honor within the mind one in whose speech the name Krishna is present. Honor with obeisances one worshipping Isha, if they have Diksha. Honor with service one adept in bhajan and one pointed. and honor with the attainment of aspired for association, one of heart free from defamation, and so forth, of others. So this interpretation is based on the Sanskrit commentary on the Upadeshamrita by Radharaman Goswami. More commonly, we hear of a threefold interpretation of the verse, but that Sanskrit commentator gives a fourfold interpretation. In any case, the idea is that the more advanced the bhakt is, the greater extent to which the honor is to be honored. So, people who chant the name of Krishna, in your mind, respect them. But if they have diksha, if they've formally dedicated themselves to the path, then one can also externally, physically show pranam to them. And if the person is very adept and very one-pointed in their practice, then they're worthy of being served. And if they're also free from engaging in any form of ninda, in other words, if their heart is very, very pure, then they can be treated with the very, service and the very highest regard, the very best behavior. Like this, some practical considerations are offered. So now we'll conclude the section. In sum, with consideration of both the fundamental honorability of all entities and the relative degree of honor that is to be shown to each individual entity, based on their relative level of awareness and bhakti to Sri Bhagavan, the commentator on the verse under discussion describes one who is respectful, or mānadena, as, quote, an offer of appropriate honor and so forth, meaning that honor is to be offered in a socially appropriate manner, befitting the characteristics of the recipient based on an underlying understanding of the recipient being a dwelling place of Sri Bhagavan. And that offering of honor, moreover, should be motivated by conviction in all of the above, as well as, in the case of sadhakas, aspiring for, or siddhas realized in Braja Bhakti, the spirit of unconditional, supportive behavior and well-wishing, bandhutva, that is characteristic of both the residents of Braja and Bhagavan Sri Krishna of Gokula himself. So a little extra plug for Jiva Goswami's point from Anucheta 106. So one way, we can consider it is that the commentator here on Padyavali, his commentary on this Tṛṇād sunīcena verse is very short. And his commentary on this quality of mānadena is just one little phrase. Honor, offer honor to others as is appropriate. So this whole fat stack of discussion is basically just an explanation of the commentary. What does it mean to offer honor appropriately? Finally, it should also be understood that the attitude of honoring others thus far described is also intended to be practically integrated into the broader web of social norms and dealings in human society. In other words, this also should be normalized, or not that somehow we get all this idea and then we start doing stuff that's strange, or that doesn't actually convey respect, or that becomes socially awkward. It should be applied in a way that gels with the reality of the circumstances in which one is in. For example, it is described in Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita that when Sri Sanatana Gosvami Prabhupada arrived in Puri from Vrindavan, he was, quote, as appropriate an object of grace, friendship, and honor from the bhaktas who received him there. This indicates that those who were regarded as his social superiors and elders blessed him, those who were regarded as his peers treated him as a friend, and those who were regarded as his juniors showed formal respect to him. So, the etiquette is to, as is everything that we've discussed, the understanding is everything that we've discussed, but then depending on who you're actually honoring, the exact practical norms of how one should relate to that person will also play a role in the manner in which the respect is shown. In other words, if someone is elder, if someone is far more educated, if someone is of great social status, and then they meet someone without all of those qualities, and then they, by virtue of that knowledge and so forth, think, oh, this is an entity pervaded by the presence of Bhagavan, and then they go and show like a whole lot of respect to this other person, that person might feel really embarrassed or might feel really awkward by receiving this, which is kind of outside the norms of social circumstances. So that will not result, it might in one sense be respectful, but to show excessive respect to someone who it's not entirely due makes that gesture of respect less meaningful when it is offered to a person who's truly worthy of that degree of respect. And it also creates social awkwardness. So one, according to one's knowledge, according to one's understanding, one should be, generous undoubtedly with the manner in which his respect is shown, but it should also be shaped by the social circumstances, such as, whether one is elder or whether one is younger or other things that will also have a bearing on the manner that is appropriate to show respect. And also, who else is there at that time? What is the circumstance? Sometimes, we experience when we're outside of India, the custom of bowing and putting the head on the floor can be perceived as quite strange or unusual by persons who are not used to it from other cultures. So one might want to show respect to a person by going and bowing one's head in the dust before their feet. But if one does that in some public space where everyone around there thinks this is very strange and is thinking that the person receiving this other person's bowing of the head in the dust must be some kind of like brainwashing cult leader, that doesn't exactly please the person or create, an ideal circumstance or lead to a social exchange which is mutually satisfying. So it might be better to do it a little more mildly in public and perhaps more pronouncedly when persons who are not, going to be thinking or doubting the character or the integrity of the process, in their view, so to speak. So I'm just throwing this out as a loose example, but the point rather is that Sanatana Gosvami, he's the supremely worshipable acharya, but in the context of Gaura Lila, in the context of that society, he was regarded as junior by Advaita Acharya, Nityananda Prabhu, Swarup Damodar, Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, Ramananda Rai, all persons like this. If he came and approached them, they would also, they would take a dandavat from him. They might bless him or, something like this. And there's nothing weird about that. There's nothing wrong about that. That's the appropriate manner of exchange. And it's not that they don't understand who is Sanatana Gosvami or something like this, but that they would have these exchanges of respect, and that respect is conveyed by doing what is appropriate to one's social role in the exchange between the two people. So similarly, in the case of a senior, they might, show respect to a junior through a gesture which in one sense might be condescending, but is actually a legitimate way of honoring the well-being and the dignity of the person. So anyway, that's the point. So finally, each of these behaviors is equally appropriate and a rightful expression of the principle being taught in the verse under discussion regarding honoring others as appropriate. It should thus be understood that in each practical act of honoring another in the course of life, the exact manner in which the... autosave moves the file. It should thus be understood that each practical act of honoring another in the course of life, the exact manner in which the offering of honor is externally offered, as per the degree of honorability of the recipient, is to be made in accord with the social and relational norms relevant to the exchange. In other words, don't do weird stuff or awkward stuff in the name of this principle. Harmonize it well with the social circumstances, and that will be ideal. So that will conclude our discussion of giving honor to others, or mānadena. So I think I'll leave it at that for today. And in our next reading, we'll dive into the next quality of amāninā, or non-conceitedness. And as we'll get to later, a second meaning of which is to be non-desirous of receiving respect or receiving honor from others. In other words, one should be generous and quite inclined to offer respect, but not hung up on or expecting to receive it in return. So what that entails, and what is the psychological core of that attitude, and how indispensable that is for a bhakta to reach higher levels of bhakti as well as achieve the further quality of dainya or humility, that will all come up in our forthcoming discussion. So I conclude here for today. If anyone has any comments, questions, corrections, otherwise, please feel free to share.
Baba, I have a question.
Okay.
Like observation, actually. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you.
So first thing come to mind is the. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello. Yeah. So first thing came to mind is the Gandhi's Harijan's movement. Like everybody's Harijan, whoever is poor and give respect to poor, and sort of communism idea. Everybody's equal and respectful in a way that regardless of their status. And but actually promoting people who are not really, I couldn't say not worth of honor, but based on the fact that people are just simply poor, they require more honor than everybody else as the deprived ones. So this would be would it be non-Vaishnava approach? Would you say?
Yeah,
yes.
This is where it becomes a challenge of balance. Because everyone should be honored, and people who are socially deprived need some extra support because they're not getting that from their family or from their financial means the way people who do have a supportive financial situation and means have. So they do require respect and they do require some extra support. But if in the course of trying to provide that respect or some support, it turns into a mandate to show excessive regard for persons who don't have the qualities that are worthy of receiving that degree of regard and who don't perform or don't offer a benefit to society that's commiserate with the level of resources and respect that's shown to them, that creates an inefficiency or a glitch, if you will, in the flow of the social order. So that's no doubt a difficult challenge to balance, and no political system has ever achieved complete success in that balance, and that's one of the ongoing rubs of worldly existence, if you will, and all different ideologies try to solve it in different ways. Some have met with greater success than others. So I can't necessarily say that one system is better than another, but just that we should respect the complexity and the challenge of the matter and strive to always show respect to people, even if they are poor or uneducated or whatever. But at the same time, not that should become something excessive to the point where the persons are not also somehow brought to integrate into the strata of being contributing members of society at the same time. Does that touch on what you wanted to bring up?
Yeah, it did touch. It did touch. And another thing, which is important, first thing you said that the one who is the lowest level of Shraddha is that someone who is Shraddha in Thakur but doesn't worship Vaishnavas and others. And I find it awkward because how can you worship others or not worship others? Does it refers to like utmost worship, meaning like one who has, that was his highest bhakta, right? He would worship Thakur, Vaishnavas, and others. Would the word worship refer to actually utmost respect towards everybody else? So I find the word worship sounds a little awkward in respect to everybody else except Vaishnavas and Thakur.
Sure. In this context, when the reference is to others, it would mean recognizing and respecting the pervading presence of Bhagavan within them, but not necessarily doing puja to them or serving them the way a Vaishnava might be served. In other words, Jiva Goswami, he glossed it as a lack of the quality in a bhakta in the form of respect for everyone. So, to worship the deity, but not recognize that the bhaktas are also fit to be served, and that everyone else is also fit to be respected. That would be kind of the most practical way of rendering the concept.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right, great. Well, let's conclude there for today. And I look forward to continuing this discussion of these sober and fundamental and also very enriching topics which pervade all of our, daily practices throughout life and lead to a lot of enrichment if we can keep steadily endeavoring to put them into action in our life. So, Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Radhe Shyam.
Jai Shri Radhe.
Jai Shri Radhe.